So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Again, my name is Naomi Freeman and I'm a WWCode advisor. I'm also a former leadership fellow for both the data science and blockchain tracks here at WWCode. Today's session is starting the conversation, tech ethics, with our amazing partner, Red Ventures. As you probably saw in the event description, ethics around technology and data continue to make headlines, both positive and negative. As technology becomes more sophisticated, questions around ethics will continue to become more prevalent. The decisions that we make today are not only impactful to our company and customers, but also play a role in shaping the next generation of technology and technologists. The question of ethics goes well beyond right and wrong, and this talk today is going to explore the basics of tech ethics, the neutrality of technology, the biggest threats that we face in the space today, and the steps we can take to keep the conversation going. So I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Lyndsey Pippin. Lyndsey is a senior software engineer at Red Ventures. Her career started at Red Ventures over 7 years ago, where she has had the opportunity to work across many teams and technologies, both consumer-facing and internal. When she's not working, she's trying her best to parent a teenager, and she enjoys paddleboarding and cross-stitching. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lyndsey. I will stop my screen share and pass it over to you now.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Naomi, and Women Who Code. I'm very excited to be speaking with you all today and about tech ethics. Can I get a thumbs up? Can everyone see my screen before I continue? I think that's a yes. Awesome. Okay, great. Awesome. So I am Lyndsey Pippin. I am a senior software engineer. Naomi already did a great job of introducing me, so I won't belabor that. But I have spent 7 years at Red Ventures. I've moved around a ton there. I've had the opportunity to not only watch our company transform and grow into what it is today, but my roles and the hats that I've worn over that time have gotten to grow and transform as well. So I've been involved in a lot of different initiatives and different projects. From my early days at RV to integrating our partners' APIs into a homegrown sales platform. So I started there doing that, and then to so many iterations of contact lead forms, online card experiences, and data feeds. So many data feeds. And if you've built one, you know what I'm talking about. There's so many. But in January of 2020, I had the opportunity to move to what was my dream role. It was a full modern stack team, developing internal tools for employees at Red Ventures. And I got to work with some extremely talented teammates. Most of my working hours now are spent supporting software and tools for our internal corporate teams. So a similar experience there. But why am I telling you all of this? I've worked with so many different amazing people and projects over the last 7 years, but it's only been in the last year that tech ethics has really been a topic of conversations. And honestly, only within the last couple of months that I was even able to give a name to the questions and the discussions that I've been having with my friends and other technologists. I was very fortunate to have the opportunity this year to attend the Grace Hopper celebration in Orlando, or last year rather, 2022. Side note, if you are not aware, Grace Hopper celebration is an annual international conference celebrating women and diversity in technology. There, I was able to hear from experts in their fields. Almost all of them brought up the ethical ramifications of the technology that they're working within. Frances Hogan, Tracy Chow, and Ruha Benjamin, just to name a few. And that's what has inspired a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. So up until this point, The water cooler conversations that I had been having seemed to have a theme, but I didn't know what to call it or what to name it. Now I did. I had been talking about tech ethics the whole time, and that's what I'm here to talk about today. So where is this going? This is a very broad subject, tech ethics. The goal of this talk isn't to touch on all of the intricacies that is tech ethics or ethics in general, or proclaim my expertise on the subject. But I want this to be a conversation starter, sort of as a catalyst for you. So I will provide an intro to the basics of tech ethics. I'm going to talk on the tension that tech ethics creates, also what I believe to be our biggest threat, and then a call to action. So first, let's dig into tech ethics. What is it? Let's define it at least. I like to think of it as the intersection of society and technology and how they work and flow together. The core question behind tech ethics is how does or how will technology impact society? So tech ethics is just a subcategory of ethics, and the same complexities around ethics exist there as well. It's hard to determine what is ethical and what is non-ethical because we're mere humans. We have all lived unique life experiences, and we have been educated through a variety of different ways. We carry our own biases. There's simply just not a right and a wrong always. It's a lot more nuanced than that. So our individual or collective values will drive what we determine to be ethical or unethical. And then because ethicality is driven by your values or the values of your organization, there's not like a simple test to determine right or wrong. Rather, what you deem as ethical is going to be the result of what you value. A group of employees at Deloitte did a great job at grouping all of the current ethical dilemmas into 5 groups. And so I'm going to go through those. There's environmental, trustworthy AI, threats to truth, physical and mental health, and data usage. So let's break those down and give some examples. So environmental sustainability. Technology requires resources and energy. A lot of that is abstracted away now with it being in the cloud, so we don't physically see servers sitting around or energy being consumed. But it still is. It's just in a server warehouse somewhere. But the ethical questions that get raised around this are these resources being used sustainably? What role do these massive data centers and other technologies play in our environmental future? Is the carbon footprint for these technologies justified? Next is trustworthy AI. This raises questions like, are the algorithms fair and unbiased? And if they are fair and unbiased, do they provide positive value to society? For example, self-driving cars, cool. Obviously, computers hopefully can drive better than humans, and hopefully at least better than me. I do set the bar a little low, unfortunately. But what happens when the AI is faced with something that is distinctly human? Say, for example, the car realizes, okay, I'm about to crash, and I have some options around me. There's a motorcyclist in front of me without a helmet on. The motorcyclist could have chose to wear a helmet, but they chose not to. There to the right of me, there is a minivan full of properly restrained children, but nonetheless, a minivan full of children or an elderly woman legally crossing the road. What does the car do? What should it do? Should it even be aware that these are factors that it can weigh? Those are some of the questions around trustworthy AI. Then there's threats to truth. These are really popular during election cycles, and things of the sort. But these are things like misinformation, disinformation, deep fakes. Creating AI-generated content can be really efficient and really helpful to consumers, but that same technology can be used for bad. And putting words in people's mouths. I don't know if a lot of you saw the TikTok trend that was going around with Tom Cruise, and you could make him say whatever you wanted, which is light and funny, but you can infer that that could also be used for malicious reasons. And then we have physical and mental health. This dilemma looks at how is technology impacting our mental and physical health? How accessible is technology to everyone despite their physical impairments? This group also includes things like wearables and apps like the Calm app. I personally have health anxiety, and if you don't have health anxiety, don't Google it because you might magically start developing symptoms. But I bought this watch that I wear specifically so that I could better monitor my heart rate and run an ECG whenever I want. However, I feel sometimes I'm not sure if the ability to monitor my heart that closely is helping or furthering the anxiety. And then there's always Facebook making headlines after a whistleblower revealed some of their internal research that showed that there was some negligence on the impact that their apps were having on humans, specifically teenagers. And then data usage. This is likely one of the most applicable dilemmas to a lot of us in this Zoom right now. It certainly is to me. It brings questions like how much data is being collected? Why is it being collected? Do we actually need the data, or do we just think we might eventually use it? How is it being used and stored? Will it be secure? How informed is a consumer about how we're using their data? So we've seen this dilemma play out time and time again, famously in 2018 by the Queen herself, Taylor Swift. She collected the faces of her fans at the Rose Bowl. Well, she didn't. Her security team did, to check for potential stalkers. They knew her stalkers and what they looked like, and they were going to run the faces through an algorithm to determine if her stalkers were there. Her security was just trying to assure her safety, and we all want Taylor to be safe. But a lot of the fans weren't super excited about their faces being collected without their knowledge. Which leads us to the tension. Oh, the tension. And now that we've gone through the major types of ethical dilemmas, the nuances of all of the decisions that we make as technologists is hopefully more evident. There is a tension that gets created by the lack of a definitive morality. So our values are determining what is right and wrong, but our values differ from person to person. So the tension is incredibly uncomfortable because it forces us to be honest about what our values actually are. And then it reveals to us what we're willing to act on, which of our values we're willing to act on. And then it holds us accountable to our own biases. Because naturally, as humans, we're searching for a way out of the uncomfortable. No one prefers to be uncomfortable. So we look for something to provide a neutral ground so we can feel steady and good. And often that looks like something to escape accountability. That's usually when we look to technology to serve as a sort of neutral buffer. We do things like looking to statistical data to make decisions about who we should lend money to, or who we should give a higher interest rate to, or we look to code to provide a neutral decision-making engine on marketing a website to provide customers with good options that are also lucrative for the business. So we look to code to kind of create a neutral ground. But technology isn't neutral, data is not neutral, code is not neutral. None of these things can be neutral because they were either created, collected, or analyzed by humans. humans, again, full of bias, both known biases and unknown biases. So regardless of the best of intentions, it's impossible to escape partiality through technology. Well, that sounds really bleak. We can't avoid bias. So then what do we do? Well, we can't fully neutralize technology, but our awareness of these biases of technology, they allow us to hold ourselves accountable. That accountability then creates a path to intentionality, to shape our responses to these ethical dilemmas that we face. Again, your values will drive your ethical outcomes. So then that leads us to, well, what do you value? What does your organization value? What does your client value? So I'm going to use Red Ventures as an example, only because that's where the majority of my industry experience lies. And it's a given that as a for-profit company, we love driving profit. We really love EBITDA. We really love saying EBITDA. I honestly couldn't define it for you. It's one of those buzzwords that just flies around. You know the ones. No one really knows exactly what they mean, but you've heard it enough that you can use context clues to figure it out. So in this case, the purpose of Red Ventures is to generate and increase EBITDA, but it could be anything, whatever the core purpose is for your organization. But purposes alone doesn't drive ethical outcomes, and purpose generally doesn't even exist alone. It's accompanied by other values that usually appear secondary to purpose, but in regards to ethical outcomes are equally important. So at Red Ventures, we have the benefit of having our values defined in our core belief statements. So our core belief statements are well known throughout the company. They're referred to often. They're referred to in our review processes and the feedback that we receive from our peers and our managers. So everyone is well aware. They're all over the office. We all know them. Making every second count, getting better every day, winning the right way, being the change we wish to see in the world, being great people to work with, leaving the wood pile higher than you found it. So these values in this example provide a foundation for how we can shape the decisions that we make when we're faced with an ethical dilemma. So as managers and engineers and project managers and just leaders and technologists, it's our responsibility to make sure that, one, we know our core beliefs, what they are beyond making profits, what they are beyond our core purpose. We know what our beliefs are. If you don't know your values, you will intentionally drive towards something, and it may or may not be aligned with your intentions or your expectations. Number two, our responsibility is to know what the ethical dilemmas are. Like, what is the potential dilemmas that we could face, that we are facing, that we're just not seeing right now? We need to stay educated in what's going on inside and outside of our organizations in regards to tech ethics. And Taylor Swift sings it best: if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Strategy sets the scene for the tell. I couldn't make it through a presentation without quoting Taylor Swift. So there we go. And three, the decision that we're making around the dilemmas are in line with those core beliefs. So it's not only that we know the core beliefs and that we know the potential ethical dilemmas, but then our decisions are in line with that. And lastly, number four, the real challenge is we must be uncomfortable and ask the questions that hold us accountable to all of these. Unconsciously making decisions that you hope align with your core values is comfortable. Uncomfortable is asking the tough questions that maybe no one else in the room is asking, to hold ourselves and each other accountable, and self-auditing based on what we know can result in ethical dilemmas. So I was so excited to see an example of this in practice at Red Ventures earlier this year. One of our online CART teams intentionally decided that dark patterns, which, if you're not familiar with dark patterns, They're a design choice that can be manipulative or coercive to customers. Well, they decided that dark patterns weren't in line with their core beliefs as a team or of the company. Responsibility 1 and 2. They were aware of the ethical dilemmas, and they knew how they related to their core values. So then they identified that this pattern was actually in use in one of their products. So they understood that it was a lucrative choice for the business, but also understood that there was a better experience for their customers that was also profitable. That's responsibility 3. They acted and made decisions that aligned with their values. Coercive designs certainly isn't aligned with winning the right way, which is one of Red Venture's core beliefs. So they implemented a new design to remove the dark pattern, which actually continued to perform really well. So that was only possible because someone acted on responsibility number 4 and asked the uncomfortable question. They questioned a well-performing experience for customers because it didn't align with the values. They held themselves and their team accountable to both driving profits and the company's core beliefs. Which brings us to our biggest threat, I believe, in terms of tech ethics: apathy. If we don't care enough to know our core beliefs, if we don't care enough to understand the value that we're driving towards, if we don't care enough to understand the impact of the metrics and the KPIs that we're shooting for, then we won't be able to hold ourselves accountable, and we will drift. We drift away from what we say we believe, or even what we want our values to be. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, the outcome will still be the same. Once we are aware of our responsibility as technologists, not taking action is a choice. Grace Hopper says it well. The most dangerous phrase in the language is, "We've always done it this way." As we continue to uncover new biases and our technology footprint expands, our ability to reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it becomes even more important. As people working in technology, we are uniquely positioned to best understand and uncover the potential impacts of the work we do. Technology is moving and quickly, and we are so lucky to get to be at the front of it. Creating and developing and brainstorming, we're so lucky. But with that privilege of getting to play a part in history, we must also take ownership of the impact of the decisions that we're making today. It's not the responsibility of just an ethics team or new laws to get passed. But there will be more laws. There will be. Likely everyone has felt the impact of GDPR or CCPA in the ways that we interact with and think about data. In late 2022, there was a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was published. Don't worry, they're not trying to give rights to the robots just yet. They're trying to protect the humans for now, but being compliant with the new laws isn't the same as acting ethically. And luckily, we don't have to wait on more laws. As Lawrence Lessig's pathetic dot theory suggests, I don't know why they call it pathetic dot theory, it's kind of sad, but there are equally powerful forces of change available to us. In addition to law, market forces, architecture and code, social norms are also forces of change. So while laws like GDPR have forced change, laws simply cannot keep up with technology and certainly won't be able to predict the future. Humans also can't predict the future, but we can react quickly with another force of change to move the dot in the direction of our values. What would it look like, or what does it look like when we lean into these other forces? I think it looks like a design team auditing their designs to better align with good UX practices. I think it looks like leaning in to ensuring that at least your corner of the internet is accessible to everyone despite physical or cognitive impairments. Leaning in looks like questioning why we're collecting that much data when we're still unsure what we would even do with it or have a plan of how we will dispose of it. Leaning in looks like questioning a random request to bypass security protocols so you can get a project across the line just this one time, because it's so important. And I'm certain there are so many more examples of these practices playing out across this group, and I'd love to hear about them. The more we know and the more we hear about ethical dilemmas happening, the better we can intentionally ensure that we're making decisions that reflect our values. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, the goal for me was just to start the conversation, to give it a name if it didn't already have one for you, like it didn't for me a few months ago. I am not an ethics expert by any means. I'm just really passionate about it. Tech ethics is relevant globally and impacts almost everyone. A lot of my experience and thoughts on tech ethics are rooted in web development in the United States, because that's been the majority of my industry experience. But the impact of tech ethics goes far, far beyond that. I gave some light illustrations today, but in some areas of the world, tech ethics and the dilemmas that they create are playing a more prominent role in the day-to-day existence of the people, which is why I'd love to keep this conversation going and really expand on it. Part of the responsibility that I spoke about earlier is to know what's going on around you. But in my web development corner of the internet, I don't always hear about things that are going on in AI or things that are going on with health technology. I gave a similar presentation at my company's tech summit and followed it up by creating a Slack channel in our organization's workspace to keep the discussion going. There, we've been able to share experiences and seek advice for ethical dilemmas as they arise. A similar Slack channel has been created in the Women Who Code workspace so that we can keep this conversation going. I'm really excited to hear more about how tech ethics are showing up for each of you in your particular experiences and your perspectives, how you're reacting to them, how you're learning and growing more. What resources are you using? And even if you aren't an ethics nerd like myself, I hope you do feel more empowered to ask questions that aren't being asked or even thought about. Because even if something is profitable and we can do it, should we? So it is profitable, apparently, to send satellites into space and create a billboard. But should we do it? But as our CEO, Rick Elias, famously says, facts are not reasons. That's more than enough talking for me today. Thank you so much for bearing with my cold and my stuffy voice. Now, if we have time, I'd love to hear from you and see how these ethical dilemmas are playing out for you.
Thanks so much, Lyndsey. Lots of thanks in the chat, and we do have some Q&A questions as well. Really appreciate you walking us through some of these considerations with tech ethics, and the chat is just very busy right now. We have dropped the link for the tech ethics channel.
Awesome.
And maybe Stephanie can drop that again once the thanks are done rolling in. And if you will, Lyndsey, we have some questions. They're split a little bit between what it's like working at Red Ventures and also tech and AI questions. So just to switch for a second, one of the first questions we got is, what has kind of compelled you, like what has made you stay at Red Ventures for such a long period of time? What keeps you there?
That's such a good question. I get that when I do a lot of college interviews, and I get that question a lot because I have been at Red Ventures for a while compared to industry standard, I guess. But as I've been at Red Ventures, it's grown so diversely in such a short period of time that I've really gotten to experience a lot of different roles. I started as a PHP developer doing only backend. Now I'm full stack, and I really have an opportunity to kind of work with some incredible people. that are eager to teach and eager to share learnings. And that's really what's kept me at Red Ventures.
Sounds really great. Other folks in the chat are asking a little bit about that kind of web dev perspective, like in terms of if I'm working as a dev and I don't have that kind of experience in all of these different ethics pieces, like how do I know if something ethical is like walking past my code is kind of the feeling of this question. How do you start with it?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that's something that I struggle with too. I don't feel siloed, but a little siloed from these other. I definitely don't work in data science most of the time. If it is, it's very adjacent to data science, not anywhere near it. So I know there are so many things going on there that I don't even have expertise in or could understand their ethical ramifications of. So I like to really stay up on the news. I listen to podcasts and hopefully communities like the Slack channel and things like that can help create like a conversation so that things that we're not fully aware of at this moment, we don't stay unaware of.
That's really helpful. Someone else has a question, again, from that dev perspective. What is a way you think that this can be mitigated, these kind of ethics challenges with larger teams? Like, should we be doing more testing, pushing for discussions? Like, what should we be pushing for when we're a bigger team?
That's a good question because ethics are so nuanced. And so the idea of having some oversweeping solution doesn't necessarily seem like the right way. But I feel as though ethics should be part of our personal responsibility as developers. We should be raising the questions. And when it is in a larger team, sometimes that means speaking up in meetings that you normally wouldn't want to speak up in, and really pushing for things that apply those core values.
And I'd say, if I can add, that having worked from the perspective of a dev, working into databases, starting to move towards infrastructure, for me, some of these questions started to come up when I was working with nonprofits and like social housing questions. And so I try and apply this thinking now to other problem sets. For the person with the least power at the other end of this technology, what's the worst thing that could happen, right?
Oh, that's good, Naomi. I love that.
Thanks. So for example, in our problem set, the first one I encountered, it was like, if we marry the data, so-and-so's name at this address with, they need a repair on their door, window, etc., and they are someone who earns, say, $500, 500 euros per month, what's the worst thing that can happen? And with return time from, repairs being up to 3 months, then what? And so it moves the question away from, should we add encryption? Should we separate data? Should we whatever? To a very concrete, specific question about who that person is on the other end that has the least amount of power. And you can apply it to banking, you can apply it to other nonprofit situations, but I'm sure there's different ways to apply it to, everyday applications that we're using as well. Just looking at some of these other questions. We've got some links going through about book recommendations. Someone has asked about book recommendations to dig further into these topics. I have a couple of books here, but I'd love to hear your recommendations too, Lyndsey.
I would love to hear yours, Naomi. I am honestly a podcast fanatic. I wish I was more of a reader.
Here's my stack of it. Am I blurred? I'm blurred. Hold on. How do I unblur me? There we go. We can see some of my books here. So if we want to think about the larger questions, one of them I want to think about is automating inequality. And that really gets into how tools are creating these exclusion factors and how we can think about ways around it. Another one I really love that's more related to finance is the Black Box Society. And this one really gets into how do algorithms make finance and banking go? But they also get into a lot of other questions. As you can see, I tag stuff in here as being particularly useful. So I come back to this one with a lot of different questions. But when we're thinking about as well some of the ethics questions, if you haven't picked it up, algorithms of oppression, this is a really good one. You don't have to read it all at once. It can be really good to grab one of these books and kind of, set up a book club, maybe share some of the questions that you have, work on it chapter by chapter, because it can be a lot of information to take in at once. And this is stuff that gets really, really deep, maybe not as technical, but thinking about technical context using these different lenses. And there's a lot of good recommendations too in the chat for folks who are thinking about this. Lots of people sharing links and sharing their own recommendations. So if anyone else has weapons of mass destruction, that's a really good one too. Coded bias on Netflix. There's a couple of things that are happening. So yeah, keep sharing those recommendations with each other. And perhaps in that continuing conversations channel on Slack, we could also be thinking about, I don't know, making a book club or sharing some recommendations there. What else do we have in? These are really great questions. I'm just trying to look at them and kind of group some of the questions together. Someone is wondering about accessible technology and whether that falls into tech ethics. Yeah, can you speak to that, Lyndsey?
Yeah, so I definitely think that does fall into tech ethics. That's fortunately one of my team's focuses is accessibility. If we can make at least our portion of the internet accessible to everyone, I think not doing that, there's ramifications that go well beyond like what we could discuss today of not being able, of everyone not having equal access to the information out there. But I feel like it definitely falls in line with ethics.
Absolutely. And I think with this one as well, I hear a lot of folks saying, okay, well, I'm not so familiar with ethics. I'm not so familiar with these things. But when we're thinking about accessibility in particular, if you've worked with UX or design, this one might be a little easier to like grab onto the edges of. And there's this great diagram, and I'm not sure where I saw it. And they're like, if you build something for someone with no arm, you're also building something for someone who's holding a baby or who temporarily has a plate in their hand.
That's and if we can, good.
Thanks. If we can also think about that when we're building for privacy, when we're building for ethics, when we're building for these things, rather than going to your boss and saying, I have a special interest project and I would like to introduce ethics to the world of venture capital or whatever it is that we're doing, to the world of hospital data. Instead, you can say, hey, in these couple of cases, this is how privacy by design works. This is how we can save $1 million. Do you remember that Grindr scandal where everyone's data got released? Here's how we can avoid and create some risk prevention and like address 2 or 3 cases at the same time with one tool, with one method, with one approach, and just take that UX stuff straight over and do it for designing for ethics. We've got lots of recommendations still going through the chat, so keep sharing those. Someone in the Q&A is asking for your podcast recommendations. If you can drop those in the chat, Lyndsey.
Yes, I'm scrolling through now trying to find them. And
the chat is so busy right now. Hopefully we catch all these recommendations. Then we have some other questions about Red Ventures and positions and internships. If someone from Red Ventures can drop that link again about the careers page. People are asking about how they access internships, if there's more information about the interview process, and if you need a degree to be able to work at Red Ventures.
I can speak to the last one, whether or not you need a degree. So I actually, part of Red Ventures largely supports a nonprofit called Road to Hire. that supports a lot of those who wouldn't normally have a route to formal higher education, providing that for them through different resources, a variety of different tracks. But a lot of the engineers that have come out of that, the first cohorts of that, are actually engineers at Red Ventures now. So they don't have a degree. They went through what I would consider an internal boot camp situation.
Thanks. That's really good to know. Also in that line, not thinking just about Red Ventures, but with other companies, someone's asking when we're interviewing with a tech company, what kind of questions can we ask to see if they're going to do the ethics? I mean, that's not what they asked exactly, but how can we suss that out in an interview process?
That is such a good question. And despite all of the interviews I've done, no one's ever asked me a roundabout way of getting to that. So that's a thing I'm going to add to my list of questions that I have ready to answer. But I think one, I know I keep referring back to Red Ventures because that's where the majority of my experience lies, but I know we have our core beliefs in our on our company's website. And I think I would so if someone was interviewing with me, I would be able to give that back to them because they are so well known and used. But if you're interviewing with someone and you just ask them their core, like the company's core beliefs, and they're not really sure of them, then that might make me believe that maybe they're not as prominent as the website seems. If I don't know if that answers that question.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something to think about. I think if we want to be really concrete, we can say, for example, from the perspective of a dev or a data person, how did you handle your last data breach? and whether they give you a good, like you can tell if they're fluffing it up. But in that conversation, don't just watch for the very specific things where they grab from the company policy book. They can say, oh, we're working on that. Or you'll see their face change and they'll be like, that's a great, discussion to have. We would love to see you tell us more about how you do that. Like, try and read when someone's in that interview, whether there's an active process that people across the table have a good sense of what a data breach is and what we do. And if they do have a great system, someone might say, hey, since we do build using privacy by design, at the core of this, we have X. Or based on the GDPR principles, we just updated our black box policy too. So people might start to lend you information about what they mean, or they might try and walk away from the conversation during the interview.
That is that's such a good point, Naomi.
Thank you. We have some other folks sharing information in the chat as well, in terms of looking around for these culture questions outside of the interview, outside of the scheduled time, and try and understand from other points of data, looking up how they have handled situations or not, and kind of what those things look like. We have about 5 more minutes left, and we have about 3 more questions. One of them is about internships. That link has been dropped again in the chat, so that's okay. And then the other 2 are very, very large questions. One of them is, and I'll give them both to you, but they're big questions. So one of them is, are there resources for understanding how we can attempt to make technology truly neutral or move it closer to good? And before you answer it, the other one is, how do you go thinking about your values? And they explain that in more detail in the Q&A, but.
Those are big ones. And I'm going to give a non-answer answer, which I know is not but I also think that's what's appropriate, because I do think that determining at least the last question, determining what your values are, I think that has to be an intentional exercise. I don't think, and I think it's over time, I don't think you just sit down and decide these are going to be my values. I think it's an intentional exercise over time. And a lot of times can be done as part of a reflection. So how did we handle our last data breach? What could we have done differently, and why should we have done it differently? And unfortunately, a lot of times what you value will come out through things like that, through not so great times. I think, or that's what I've experienced personally. So intentional reflection, I think, is what ultimately leads you to your personal values. And I think it's also really important to be aligned with, if you are working for a company or an organization, that you are aligned with their values as well. That for the resources on making technology more neutral. Oh, I think technology, and Naomi, I'd love to hear your perspective too, but to me, technology will always be the result of humans. So the more intentional we are about shaping the technology, the more neutral it can become. But at the end of the day, I don't know that technology will ever be able to be neutral or more neutral than the humans that are controlling it.
Yeah, that's a really fair point. And they're big questions to take on. I think neutrality is a lie. And so what we go back to here, there was a big conversation that came up around the time, hopefully I don't date myself too much, but in terms of Steve Jobs thinking about technological determinism and how technology shapes cultural values, social structures, history, I think we can take a really positive approach and say, for example, at Women Who Code, I know they use Slack as an internal communication tool, right? And we can say something about the privacy policies, we can say something about accessibility, we can say something about whatever, but we can also stop and say, hey, these are the tools we use. True or false, it fulfills the needs of the things we intend to do as a culture. And I would say at Women Who Code, Slack is a great way to be internally communicating because they value openness, transparency, being able to talk between silos, humor, things like that. So yes, we could say this tool reflects the values and the culture that we want to create, and that maybe you want to find different tools when the answer is not like that, rather than making sweeping statements against or for any particular technology at a given time. I'm not sure that quite answers the question, but we've got lots of people adding more books, the alignment problem. Yeah, there's different ways to look at it. But if we come back to the idea of neutrality, I think it was Steve Jobs or someone else in a more casual conversation was kind of talking about, well, if machines are going to run the world, then who runs the machines, before machines were really doing this? And there was this kind of joke from different people that like, oh, nuns should run the machines, right? Because it was like, we're thinking like late 80s, early 90s, right? We're making big statements like this. Think about sitcoms at the time. But there was some pushback at the time too, like who gets to decide the nuns are in charge? And what does that represent for other systems of like what we mean by good? So that's something that I would kind of caution against as we're thinking about ethics, about reaching an ultimate good. That's a philosophical problem that universities have been taking on for thousands of years. I don't think we're going to solve it in the tech ethics Zoom chat.
Yes, but much more nuanced than good and bad.
But we can aim to do the best we can with the things that we know. And as Lyndsey was talking about, we can aim to reflect, and we can also aim to understand what our outcome and meaning is, and if the tools and methods we use to get there seem to align or match. Would be my recommendation.
Yeah. And I mean, it's almost in line with like normal tech decisions that you're making. Does this tool fit this job right at this moment? Yes. 6 months from now, will I look back and think, oh, that wasn't the tool for the job because now I have new information. So now we pivot, we make changes, but we looked back, we self-audited. And that's the important part, is that self-audit and then action on it. Because you can only do the best you can with what you have. And that's the goal, is to increase what you know, so that you can make good, positive action.
Absolutely. That brings us to the top of the hour, whatever your hour may be. Thank you so much for having us. And if there's anything else you'd like to add, you can do so now. Otherwise, we will all just slip quietly into the night or our post-lunch hour slump after these delicious meals. Oh, podcast recommendations, someone's asking. Maybe you could drop those in the Slack channel.
Yes, I will drop those in the Slack channel. Sorry, I couldn't ferociously scroll through my Spotify that fast.
It's such a lively conversation. Thank you to everyone who came out to attend and to share what they know. The Slack channel has been dropped in as a link again. And thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.